The day I got the eviction notice, it wasn't just about losing my home. It was the cold, casual way my landlord explained he could make more money on Airbnb that broke something inside me. But maybe breaking was exactly what I needed. My name is Alex, and for 5 years, apartment 2B had been my sanctuary. It wasn't much, a 1-bedroom with a temperamental radiator and a view of a brick wall, but it was mine. It was where I'd built my freelance writing career from nothing, where I'd weathered a nasty breakup, and where every scuff on the hardwood floor told a story. My landlord, Mark, had always been a decent guy, or so I thought. We had an easy rhythm. I paid my rent on time, he'd fix a leaky faucet within a day, and we'd make small talk about the weather if we passed in the hall. That all changed when his greed found a name. "It's just business, Alex," he'd said, sliding the crisp, formal eviction papers across my own dining table. "The market is just too hot right now. A place like this, done up a bit, it's a gold mine." He leaned back, a smug little smile playing on his lips, and that's when he delivered the final blow. He wanted my apartment, the one I had made a home, to turn it into a soulless, short-term rental for tourists. The done up a bit part was what really stuck with me, long after he'd left me sitting alone with the wreckage of my life. For weeks, I'd been hearing things from the vacant unit directly below me, the whine of a circular saw late at night, the heavy thud of materials being dropped, all without a single permit posted on the building's front door. When I'd asked Mark about the noise, he'd been cagey, muttering about some minor cosmetic upgrades. Now I understood. He wasn't just renovating. He was taking shortcuts, and I had a sudden sinking feeling that his rush for profit had made him dangerously careless. The silence after the door clicked shut behind him was heavier than any sound. I just sat there, staring at the eviction notice on my table, its sharp, legalistic font, a stark contrast to the coffee rings and worn spots that marked it as mine. It felt like an obituary for a life I was still living. The sounds from downstairs started up again that night, louder and more aggressive than before. The high-pitched scream of a saw cutting through what sounded like structural beams, the percussive slam of a sledgehammer against concrete. Every thud vibrated through my floorboards, a constant, physical reminder of Mark's betrayal. He wasn't just renovating. He was gutting the building's integrity, one illegal shortcut at a time. My real worry, though, wasn't for my own shaking floor. It was for Mrs. Gable in 2C. She's 84 and has lived in this building since the Nixon administration. Her apartment is her entire world, a museum of a long and loving life, filled with photos and fragile keepsakes. She's on a fixed income, and the idea of her having to find a new place, let alone afford one in this city, was unthinkable. The next morning I saw her in the hall, her hand trembling as she held onto the wall for support. "Oh, Alex," she'd whispered, her voice thin as paper. "Did you feel that shaking last night?" I thought my china cabinet was going to topple. I assured her it was probably nothing, a lie that tasted like ash in my mouth. She was the stake in this game I hadn't realized I was playing. She was the one who would pay the highest price for Mark's greed. The final straw came 3 days later. I was in my kitchen when the entire building groaned, a deep, guttural sound of stress. It was followed by a violent shudder that knocked my favorite mug off the counter, shattering it on the floor. A second later, a deafening crash echoed from the apartment below. I froze, listening. Dust puffed up from the gap between the floor and the wall. Then I saw it, a thin, jagged line snaking its way up the plaster behind my stove, a brand new crack in the foundation of my home, and a terrifying symbol of how rotten things had become. My anger, which had been a slow burn, ignited into a blaze. This wasn't just about losing my home to some soulless Airbnb listing anymore. This was about Mark putting lives at risk, putting Mrs. Gable at risk, all for a few extra dollars from tourists who wouldn't know or care that they were sleeping in a death trap. That's when I knew I couldn't just pack my boxes and leave quietly. I had to do something. It's one thing to get pushed out of your home, but it's another thing entirely to realize your landlord might literally bring the whole house down around you. If you've ever felt powerless against someone like that, you're going to want to see what I did next. Make sure you like and subscribe, because this is where my little eviction story turns into a full-blown revenge plot. My phone was in my hand before I'd even fully processed the spiderweb of a crack spreading up my kitchen wall. I was about to call the city, the fire department, anyone, when a faint, panicked cry echoed from the hallway. "Help! Oh dear heavens, help me!" It was Mrs. Gable. I threw my door open and sprinted the few feet to 2C. Her door was slightly ajar, pushed open by the same tremor that had shattered my mug. I shoved it the rest of the way and my blood ran cold. She was on the floor, tangled in her favorite Afghan, surrounded by a cloud of white dust and chunks of fallen plaster. A huge section of her living room ceiling had given way, crashing down onto the very spot where she sits to watch her game shows. Her beautiful, dark wood china cabinet, the one full of generations of memories, was now coated in a thick layer of gray powder. A few delicate teacups lay in pieces on her carpet. I rushed to her side. "Mrs. Gable, are you hurt?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror, her face streaked with dust. "Alex, the ceiling, it just fell." She was trembling uncontrollably, but, miraculously, seemed physically unharmed. The plaster had missed her by inches. Seeing her like that, so small and vulnerable on the floor of her own home, a home that had just tried to swallow her, flipped a switch in my brain. The anger wasn't a hot blaze anymore. It was a sub-zero freeze. It was the chilling, absolute certainty of what I had to do. Mark hadn't just been careless. He hadn't just been greedy. He had almost killed this sweet, gentle woman. The image of some tourist family checking in, excited for their New York adventure, while Mrs. Gable lay buried under rubble, flashed in my mind. The injustice of it was a physical weight in my chest. I helped her to her feet and settled her onto the sofa, brushing the dust from her shoulders. Then I walked out of her apartment, my steps unnaturally steady. I found Mark on the sidewalk, directing two men unloading boxes of cheap, flat-pack furniture from a truck. He was smiling, already picturing the 5-star reviews. "A section of Mrs. Gable's ceiling just collapsed," I said. My voice came out quiet, devoid of any emotion. It almost hit her. He barely glanced at me, waving a hand dismissively. "Old buildings, Alex. Things fall apart. It's probably for the best anyway." I stared at him, uncomprehending. For the best? She could have been killed. He finally turned to face me, his smile gone, replaced by a look of pure predatory annoyance. "It'll motivate her to find a new place faster, won't it? I can't exactly turn that unit into a profitable Airbnb with her and all her old junk in the way." That was it. That was the moment the floor fell out from under me for the second time. It wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. He saw the near death of an elderly woman as a convenient opportunity to expedite his business plan. He wasn't just a greedy landlord. He was a monster. There was no reasoning with him, no appealing to a shred of humanity that simply wasn't there. As I stood there on the sidewalk, the city noise fading into a dull roar, I knew there was no going back. Packing my bags and leaving was no longer an option. He had declared war, and I was going to make sure he lost everything. I walked away from him without another word, the sound of his voice, callous and dismissive, chasing me back into the building. The fury I felt on the sidewalk had cooled into something hard and dense in my gut, a block of ice. He wasn't just a monster. He was a monster who was confident he could get away with it. He was probably right. My first and only instinct was to fight him with the rules he was so blatantly ignoring. I went back to my apartment, stepping over the shattered remains of my mug, and pulled out my laptop. My hands were steady as I typed, my movements precise. I documented everything. I took high-resolution photos of the crack in my kitchen, using a ruler for scale. I went back to Mrs. Gable's apartment, under the guise of checking on her, and took photos of her collapsed ceiling, the piles of plaster, the broken teacups. She sat huddled on her sofa, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild afternoon, and I felt a fresh wave of protective rage. With a folder of digital evidence saved to my desktop, I found the number for the city's Department of Buildings. I was put on hold for 22 minutes, the tinny, looping music, a special kind of bureaucratic torture. When a man with a weary, monotone voice finally answered, I launched into my story. I explained the unpermitted construction, the late-night noise, the structural damage, the collapsed ceiling, and the fact that an elderly woman had been inches from serious injury or death. I stressed the urgency, the clear and present danger. Did you see a permit posted? He asked, his voice devoid of interest. No, that's the point. There are no permits. He's gutting the unit. I think he's even hit support beams. A sigh crackled through the phone. Okay, I can log the complaint. What's the address? I gave it to him. I spelled out Mark's name. I explained. The whole situation was so he could illegally convert the rent-stabilized units into a high-turnover Airbnb for a quick profit. I thought adding the motive, the sheer, greedy illegality of it all, might light a fire under them. It didn't. All right, I've got a file started, he droned. You'll be issued a complaint number via email in the next 2 to 3 business days. An inspector will be assigned to the case. An inspector? When? When will they come? The building isn't safe. He's still working down there right now. Sir, he said, and the condescending tone made my knuckles turn white. We have thousands of complaints. Non-emergency inspections are scheduled in the order they are received. It could be several weeks. This is an emergency. A ceiling collapsed on an old woman. Was she transported to a hospital? No, but she was terrified. It missed her by inches. Sir, if there isn't a documented injury, it's not classified as an immediate emergency. You'll have to wait for an inspector like everyone else. The line went dead. He had hung up on me. I sat there in the ringing silence, staring at the phone in my hand. It felt like I had just been told, in the most banal way possible, that Mrs. Gable's life was worth less than a bit of paperwork. The system I thought was built to prevent this exact scenario, to protect tenants from predators like Mark, was a labyrinth of indifference. It was a wall designed not to help, but to deflect. The next few days were a living hell. The construction sounds from below continued, a relentless reminder of my powerlessness. Every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I checked on Mrs. Gable 3-4 times a day. She'd stopped leaving her apartment entirely, too scared of what might fall next. My eviction date loomed, a ticking clock counting down not just to my homelessness, but to the moment I'd be forced to leave her here alone in this death trap. Mark knew the system was slow. He was counting on it. He'd be done with his shoddy renovation and have his first guests checked in long before a city inspector ever bothered to show up. My fear, sharp and constant, began to curdle back into that cold, hard resolve. The system had failed. The rules were a joke. And if no one else was going to stop him, I would have to. That dead-end phone call broke something in me that Mark's eviction notice hadn't. It was the crushing realization that the safety nets I'd taken for granted were imaginary. There was no one coming to help. I was just a complaint number in a queue, waiting my turn while the floor beneath me was being sawed out from under an 84-year-old woman. The days that followed were a blur of impotent fury. The sounds from downstairs became my personal soundtrack to hell, a mix of power tools and the phantom echo of a bureaucrat telling me my emergency wasn't an emergency. Then, one evening, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on my door. Not the mailman, not a delivery. I knew instinctively who it was. I opened it to find Mark standing there, his face a mask of controlled rage. He was holding a single sheet of paper. My complaint. I got a letter from the city today, Alex, he said, his voice dangerously low. He didn't need to raise it. The menace was rolling off him in waves. A complaint about unpermitted work. It seems you've decided to be difficult. Before I could answer, he pushed past me, stepping into my apartment as if he still owned every molecule of air inside it. He walked straight into my kitchen and looked at the crack in the wall. He ran a finger along it, a parody of a thoughtful inspection. You've made this harder than it needed to be, he said, turning back to me. But it doesn't change anything. You're still out. Mrs. Gable is still out. In this apartment, he gestured around at my life, my home, is still going to be a top-rated Airbnb by the end of the month. He smiled, a tight, cruel twist of his lips. I'll even be sure to patch this crack you're so worried about. Can't have anything marring the experience for my first guests. The sheer audacity of him standing in my home and threatening me with the details of its destruction sent a tremor of fear through me that was quickly consumed by a cold, clarifying anger. He was untouchable, and he knew it. He turned and walked out, leaving my front door wide open, a final gesture of contempt. The real invasion came later that night. I was jolted awake not by a saw or a hammer, but by a sound I couldn't place. A deep, sickly groan, followed by a wet, tearing noise. I sat up in bed, listening. Then I heard it. Drip, drip, drip. I flipped on the light and my stomach plummeted. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across my bedroom ceiling, centered right above my bed. As I watched, a fat droplet of murky water gathered, hung for a moment, and then fell onto my pillow. Then another. And another. The dripping quickened, and I scrambled out of bed just as a sagging section of the drywall gave way. A cascade of filthy water, mixed with chunks of plaster and insulation, poured onto my mattress. The smell hit me next. Stagnant, rotten. It was the smell of a burst pipe, of decay. He had done it. In his reckless, corner-cutting fury, Mark had ruptured something in the guts of the building. The water was now streaming down the wall, pooling on the hardwood floor I'd so carefully maintained. I watched, frozen in horror, as the stream of water ran directly over an electrical outlet, which sparked once, violently, before the lights in my bedroom flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The only sounds left were the relentless gush of water and the frantic thumping of my own heart. This wasn't a crack in the wall anymore. This wasn't a potential danger. This was a flood, a fire hazard. This was an active, undeniable catastrophe, and it was happening right now. And in that dark, waterlogged room, a new plan began to form. Mark had just handed me the weapon I needed. He had escalated the situation from a problem an inspector could ignore for weeks to a 5-alarm emergency they would have to see for themselves. The darkness was absolute, but the chaos was a symphony. The rushing water was the string section, a constant, sickening hiss. The intermittent dripping from different spots in the ceiling was the percussion. And beneath it all, the low hum of my own icy calm. My apartment was being destroyed, my belongings ruined, but I felt no panic. I felt a strange, thrilling clarity. Mark had been using a sledgehammer, but I was about to use a scalpel. I didn't need the lights. I knew the layout of my apartment by heart. I waded through the deepening puddle in my bedroom, my bare feet sloshing in the filthy water, and felt my way to the living room. My phone was on the coffee table. I picked it up, its screen, a brilliant beacon in the gloom. I didn't call the Department of Buildings. I didn't call a lawyer. I dialed 911. When the operator answered, my voice was as steady as a surgeon's hand. I'm at 412 Maple Street, apartment 2B. A pipe has burst in the ceiling of my apartment. My bedroom is flooding. Is anyone injured, sir? No, I said calmly, but the water is pouring directly onto an electrical outlet. It sparked, and all the power in my unit went out. I'm concerned about an electrical fire. There was no hesitation on her end. No bureaucratic sigh. Fire services are on their way, sir. Please evacuate the building immediately. I hung up and moved with purpose. I grabbed my keys and my wallet from the bowl by the door. Then I went to Mrs. Gable's apartment and banged on the door, louder than I ever had before. She opened it a crack, her face pale with fear. Alex? What is it? There's a major leak, Mrs. Gable. A pipe burst. The fire department is on the way. We need to get out of the building right now. Seeing the genuine emergency in my eyes, she didn't argue. She just grabbed the shawl from the back of her armchair and let me guide her out into the hallway and down the stairs. As we reached the ground floor lobby, the first wail of a siren cut through the night, growing closer with astonishing speed. This was the emergency they couldn't ignore. We stepped out onto the sidewalk just as the first fire engine, immense and brilliant red, rounded the corner, its lights painting the street in frantic strokes of red and white. A second truck followed close behind. The building's front door flew open, and Mark stumbled out, wearing a bathrobe and a furious expression, ready to yell at whatever tenant had dared to cause this commotion. Then he saw the fire trucks. He saw the firefighters, grim-faced and efficient, already pulling hoses and grabbing axes. He saw me, standing next to a shivering Mrs. Gable on the sidewalk. His eyes locked on mine, and in them I saw it all happen in an instant. The anger, the confusion, then the dawning, stomach-dropping horror. He looked from my face up toward my second-floor window, where the dark, murky water was now beginning to seep out from the frame and trickle down the brick facade. He understood. This wasn't something he could dismiss as an old building. This wasn't a complaint he could intimidate his way out of. This was a 5-alarm catastrophe of his own making, and he had just lost control. His dream of a 5-star Airbnb was drowning in a torrent of his own greed and negligence. A fire chief, his helmet tucked under his arm, strode directly toward us. He ignored me and Mrs. Gable, his gaze fixed squarely on Mark, who looked like a cornered animal. "Are you the owner of this building?" the chief asked, his voice a low rumble of authority that carried easily over the hum of the engines. I watched Mark's mouth open, but no sound came out. The flashing lights danced across his face, illuminating the sweat beading on his forehead. All the smugness, all the predatory confidence was gone, washed away. He was just a man in a bathrobe, staring at the consequences of his actions as they prepared to bring his whole rotten world crashing down. And I stood there watching, knowing I had lit the fuse. Mark finally managed to croak out, I'm the owner," just as 2 firefighters, armed with heavy pry bars and a thermal camera, pushed past him and disappeared into the lobby. The chief nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving Mark's face. "We've got water coming out the second-floor facade and reports of an electrical fire. We're shutting off power and water to the whole building." Mark sputtered. "The whole building? It's just one unit, a small leak." "It's my job to decide what's small, sir," the chief said, cutting him off with cold precision. He gestured for us to move further back onto the sidewalk. I kept a protective arm around Mrs. Gable, who was watching the chaos with wide, frightened eyes. For 10 minutes, the only sounds were the crackle of the chief's radio and the shouts of the firefighters inside. Then, one of the men who had first gone in came jogging back out, his face streaked with soot and something else, disbelief. He pulled the chief aside, but I was close enough to hear every word. "Chief, you need to see this. It's not just a burst pipe. The joists under 2B are sawed halfway through. Clean cuts. Looks like they were trying to drop the floor." My blood went cold. He continued, his voice low and urgent. "And that's not all. We checked the unit below. The one they were working on? It's the same thing on the other side. They've systematically compromised the support beams for the entire B line of apartments. It looks like they were trying to get the whole stack to collapse on itself. This building isn't just unsafe, it's been deliberately sabotaged." The world tilted. It wasn't just my apartment. It wasn't just about turning one unit into a quick flip. This was bigger, darker. The crack in my kitchen, the collapse in Mrs. Gable's ceiling, the burst pipe. They weren't accidents born of shoddy work. They were attacks, calculated acts of structural violence. He wasn't just renovating. He was trying to force a catastrophic failure. He was trying to get the building condemned on his own terms so he could tear it down and build his profitable tourist trap from scratch. He hadn't just been willing to let Mrs. Gable die. He had been actively trying to make it happen, to make her home, my home, unlivable in the most terrifying way possible. The monster I saw wasn't just a monster of greed. He was a monster of calculated, destructive ambition. The chief turned slowly, his face like granite. He walked right up to Mark, who had gone a pale, sickly green under the flashing lights. "Your contractor seems to have a funny way of renovating," the chief said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Care to explain why half the support structure on the north side of this building has been intentionally sawed through?" Mark's jaw worked, but he was a cornered rat, his brain scrambling for a lie big enough to cover the truth. "What? No, that's impossible. My contractor, he must have. I had no idea. I'm a victim here too. That's when I stepped forward, my voice cutting through his pathetic defense. He's lying. The chief and Mark both turned to look at me. The smug, predatory confidence was long gone from Mark's face, replaced by pure animal panic. He told me himself what he was doing, I said, looking directly at the fire chief. He served me an eviction notice because he wanted my apartment. He wants to turn the whole building into a giant, illegal Airbnb. He told me Mrs. Gable, an 84-year-old woman, was in the way, and that her ceiling collapsing was for the best because it would motivate her to find a new place faster. This wasn't a mistake. He was trying to terrorize us all out so he could cash in. I had no photos of sawed-through beams, no engineering degree. All I had was the truth of his motive. And in that moment, it was the most powerful weapon in the world. It was the missing piece, the why, that turned a bizarre case of property damage into a clear-cut criminal enterprise. The chief stared at me, then at Mark, whose face had crumpled in defeat. The lie was too big, and my truth was too specific. A police car, called by the fire department, had already pulled up silently to the curb. "This building is condemned," the chief announced to no one in particular. He then jerked his head toward Mark. "And I think you've got some questions to answer down at the station." Two police officers stepped forward and flanked Mark. As they led him away, his bathrobe flapping open, his eyes found mine one last time. There was no anger in them now, only the hollow, bottomless shock of a man who had gambled everything on his own monstrosity and lost. The red and white lights continued to flash across the face of my building, my home, illuminating the water that still trickled from my window like tears. I had won. He was ruined. And I was homeless. The back of the police car swallowed him whole, and the flashing lights seemed to lose their frantic energy, settling into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The sirens were gone. The shouting was gone. All that was left was the hum of the fire truck's engine and the quiet drip, drip, drip of water from my window onto the dark pavement below. The cold night air, which I hadn't even noticed before, suddenly seeped into my bones. My hands, which had been so steady when I dialed 911, began to tremble. It wasn't a violent shake, just a fine, uncontrollable tremor, the last of the adrenaline burning out of my system. I had won. The thought was so huge it had no place to land in my brain. It just hovered there, unreal. And right behind it came the other, darker truth, the one the firefighter had revealed. He was trying to get the whole stack to collapse. He hadn't just been cutting corners, he'd been cutting the building's throat. My breath hitched, a half sob, half gasp of delayed shock. He had been trying to bring the building down around us. The image of Mrs. Gable, buried under tons of plaster and wood, flashed in my mind, and this time it felt sickeningly real. "Alex?" Mrs. Gable's voice was a frail whisper next to me. I looked down at her, her small hand clutching my arm. Her face, illuminated by the rotating lights, was a mixture of terror and a strange dawning comprehension. Did they take him away?" "Yes, Mrs. Gable," I said, my own voice sounding distant. "They took him away. It's over." A police officer, a woman with tired but kind eyes, approached us, holding a notepad. "You're Alex from 2B?" she asked. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "We're going to need a full statement from you, but first, let's get you and the lady here somewhere warm." She gestured to her patrol car. "You can sit in the back while we talk." I helped Mrs. Gable into the car, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. As I sat down opposite the officer in the passenger seat, the story began to pour out of me. It wasn't a panicked rant anymore. It was a timeline. I started with the eviction notice. I told her about the illegal construction, the noise, the fear. I told her about my call to the Department of Buildings and the indifferent response. I showed her the complaint number they'd emailed me, still unread on my phone. Then I told her about Mark's threats, his visit to my apartment. I told her his exact words. "It'll motivate her to find a new place faster." The officer's pen stopped moving for a second. She looked up at me. "He said that? About Mrs. Gable?" "Verbatim," I confirmed. He saw her nearly dying as a business opportunity. His entire plan from the start was to get us out so he could convert the whole building into one big, unpermitted Airbnb. He told me that too. He wasn't hiding it. He was proud of it. I explained how the pieces fit together. The eviction notices weren't just about flipping a couple of units. They were the first step. The dangerous construction wasn't just shoddy. It was a campaign of terror. The system had failed to stop him, so he escalated, believing he was invincible. The fire chief's report about the sawed-through beams was the physical evidence, but my story was the motive. It was the context that turned Mark from a reckless idiot into a man who would risk mass casualties for a 5-star review. The officer listened, her expression growing harder with every word. When I was done, she simply said, "Thank you. You did the right thing." It was the validation the man on the phone had denied me. It was the system, finally working. A Red Cross volunteer arrived and took Mrs. Gable to a temporary shelter. I gave my final details to the officer. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, the last of the emergency vehicles pulled away. The street fell silent. My building was dark, wrapped in yellow tape that read, "Do not cross." It looked like a tomb. I stood on the sidewalk, the keys to my apartment heavy and useless in my pocket. I had my wallet, my phone, and the clothes on my back. I had saved Mrs. Gable. I had stopped a monster. And I was completely, utterly alone. I don't know how long I stood there, a ghost on my own street. The sun came up, casting long shadows and turning the yellow tape into a garish mockery of a ribbon on a prize. The prize was my life, I guess, and Mrs. Gable's, but it felt like I'd been given a trophy made of broken glass. I finally moved when the morning dog walkers started to appear, their gazes lingering on the condemned building, then sliding over to me with pity or suspicion. I couldn't bear it. I ended up on my friend Liam's couch. The phone call to him had been a masterpiece of understatement. "Hey man, got a weird favor to ask. My building had a situation. Can I crash for a few days?" He'd said yes without hesitation, and only when I showed up on his doorstep, hollow-eyed and still in my soot-stained clothes, did he see the full scope of the situation. He gave me a change of clothes and a blanket, and I collapsed onto his sofa, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the dark, listening to the water. I heard the groan of the building, the sickening tear of the drywall. Then the sounds would morph. The drip of the water would become the slow, rhythmic cut of a saw. I'd dream I was lying in bed, paralyzed, as a blade chewed through the floorboards above me, showering my face not with water but with sawdust. I'd wake up with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced the ceiling above Liam's guest bed was about to give way. The trauma wasn't just in my sleep, it followed me into the day. A car backfiring on the street made me flinch so hard I dropped my coffee. The rumble of the subway from 2 blocks away felt like the building groaning, a prelude to collapse. I was a bundle of exposed nerves, a walking, talking complaint number. The victory I'd felt watching Mark get led away had evaporated, leaving a toxic residue of fear. The worst part was the word, the brand, the reason for it all. Liam was scrolling on his laptop next to me, planning a weekend trip. "Hey, look at this place," he said, turning the screen toward me. "Cool little Airbnb up in the mountains, not too expensive." My stomach turned over. The cheerful, minimalist interface, the pictures of a cozy cabin with a 5-star rating. It was like looking at a murder weapon. I saw the smiling profile picture of the host, and all I could see was Mark's face, twisted in that predatory grin. I saw the promise of a unique local experience, and I thought of Mrs. Gable, huddled in a shelter, robbed of the only home she'd known for 50 years. This whole ecosystem of temporary living and easy profit wasn't just a housing crisis to me anymore. It was the motive for attempted murder. It was the banner under which Mark had been willing to bury us all, just to chase a few more dollars from tourists who wanted an authentic stay. "I can't," I said, my voice tight. I pushed myself off the couch and went to the window, needing air. "I can't look at that." Liam, bless him, understood immediately. "Oh man, Alex, I'm so sorry, I didn't even think." But that was the point. No one thinks. It's just an app. It's just a side hustle. It's just business. but I would never be able to see it as just anything again. It was a cancer. It was the name of the monster that had tried to eat my life. I had fought so hard to stop my home from becoming one, and in the end, it became nothing at all, just a tomb sealed with yellow tape. And I was left with nothing but the ghosts of what it had been, and a deep, abiding terror of what people were willing to do for a 5-star review. For 3 days, Liam's couch was my world. I'd drift between nightmares of splintering wood and long, hollow hours staring at the ceiling, mapping cracks that weren't there. The victory felt more like a wound. Every news alert on my phone about a multi-unit fire or a building collapse sent a jolt of sickness through me. I had survived, but the feeling of safety was a ghost limb. I could remember what it felt like, but I couldn't feel it anymore. On the 4th morning, a different feeling began to cut through the fog of trauma. It was the icy resolve from the night of the flood, returning not as a torrent, but as a slow, freezing river. I thought of the man on the phone from the Department of Buildings. His bored, condescending voice was as much a part of the structural failure as Mark saw. He was a different kind of rotten beam, a support for a system that was designed to buckle under pressure. I found the email he'd sent, the subject line a sterile string of characters, complaint number 72A4491C. I showered, put on the same borrowed clothes I'd worn for days, and took the subway downtown. The Department of Buildings felt exactly like the phone call sounded, gray, airless, and utterly indifferent. A long counter was separated from the public by a thick pane of glass, with little half-moon cutouts to speak through. I waited in line for 20 minutes behind people clutching blueprints and violation notices, each with their own story of bureaucratic hell. When my turn came, I slid the printout of the email under the glass. "I'd like to follow up on this complaint," I said. The clerk, a woman with a magnificent beehive hairdo and zero interest in my existence, typed the number into her computer. "It's in the queue," she said, not looking at me. "An inspector will be assigned in the order it was received." "There's been a development," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "The building has been condemned. The owner was arrested for reckless endangerment and multiple counts of assault. The FD&Y's report cites intentional and systematic structural sabotage." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She looked up at me for the first time. Her bored expression flickered. "What was the address again?" I told her. She typed it in, and I watched her face drain of color as whatever flags the fire department had raised now filled her screen in flashing red. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," I said. "Specifically, I'd like to speak to the person who took my call 4 days ago and told me it wasn't an emergency." That got me ushered into a small, windowless office. A few minutes later, a man in a rumpled shirt and a cheap tie walked in, holding my file. He didn't have the same voice as the man on the phone, but he had the same weary, put-upon energy. "Mr. Alex," he said, reading my name off the folder. "I'm David Chen, a shift supervisor. I understand there's been an escalation regarding your complaint." "An escalation," I repeated. The word was so mild, so bureaucratic it was almost funny. "You could call it that. I'd call it attempted murder. I called your department." I explained that my landlord was trying to intentionally force us out to build a business of illegal Airbnb units. "I told your operator that a ceiling had collapsed on my 84-year-old neighbor. He told me it wasn't an emergency because she wasn't hospitalized. He hung up on me." Mr. Chen paled. "Our call takers handle hundreds of calls a day. Sometimes they get it wrong. I finished for him, and people almost die. Your department's official position was that I should wait several weeks for an inspector. The fire chief was on site in 6 minutes. His report says that if the pipe hadn't burst, the entire B-line of the building would have likely experienced a catastrophic collapse within a week. That's my apartment." "And Mrs. Gable's?" I leaned forward, my hands flat on his desk to keep them from shaking. "Mark is going to prison. And when he's on trial, his lawyer is going to ask why the city didn't act when they were first warned. My testimony is going to include complaint number 72A 2A4491C. It's going to include a detailed description of your department's failure to act. The press seems very interested in this story. They love stories about tenants fighting back. They'll love this part too. The threat hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about his department, his job, his failure. He was no longer a supervisor managing a complaint. He was a man staring into a pit of legal and public relations liability. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to know what you're going to change," I said. "The next time a tenant calls, terrified, saying their landlord is using unpermitted construction to terrorize them out of their home for a quick profit, what will be different? Because right now, your system is a weapon for predators like Mark. He knew you'd be slow. He counted on it." He stared at me, his bureaucratic armor shattered. For the first time, he looked like a person who understood. I can flag complaints that allege tenant harassment via construction. I can create a new protocol, an immediate review for any complaint that mentions both unpermitted work and a motive of illegal conversion. It could fast-track an inspection. It wasn't a revolution. It was a single gear changing in a vast, broken machine. But it was something. It was a crack in the wall of indifference, patched. "Do it," I said, standing up, "and give me your card. I want to be able to follow up." He fumbled for his wallet, his hands trembling slightly as he handed me a small, flimsy business card. I took it and walked out of the office, out of the gray building, and back into the sunlight. I hadn't gotten my home back. I hadn't erased the trauma, but I had walked into the heart of the system that failed me and forced it to look me in the eye. I had made them see. And in the quiet aftermath of the war for apartment 2B, that felt like a victory all its own. It's been 3 months since I stood on the sidewalk and watched my life get sealed behind yellow tape. My new apartment is smaller than 2B, and the view is of a different brick wall, but the radiator is quiet and the floors don't tremble. It doesn't feel like home yet. It feels like a safe house, a place to catch my breath. The nightmares have mostly faded, replaced by what my therapist calls structural memories. The phantom creak of a floorboard that makes my head snap up. The rumble of a passing truck that sends a ghost shiver of a building's groan through my bones. They're echoes, no longer the real thing. I'm learning to live with them. Liam's couch feels like a lifetime ago, but I still have the borrowed t-shirt he gave me, folded at the bottom of a drawer, a relic from the wreckage. Last week, I painted the living room a deep, calming blue. Every brushstroke felt like an act of defiance, a reclamation of space and stability. I unpacked the few boxes of belongings that weren't ruined by the flood. Books, some clothes, a framed photo of my parents, things that made a place mine. I even bought a new mug. It's heavy and solid, and I'm ridiculously careful with it. I checked in with Mrs. Gable yesterday. Her nephew helped her find a lovely senior community just outside the city, and she sounds happier than I've heard her in years. She sends me pictures of her new apartment, brightly lit and filled with her treasures. Her china cabinet is the star of the show, gleaming and fully intact. She calls me her guardian angel, which always makes my throat tighten. I just tell her I'm glad she's safe. Mark, I learned, took a plea deal. He'll serve time, lose his properties, and be financially ruined. The news came in a text from the officer who took my statement, and I felt a quiet, exhausted sense of finality. This morning, I was cleaning out my wallet, and my fingers brushed against a flimsy, slightly bent business card. David Chen, shift supervisor. I stared at his name, remembering the airless office and the look of dawning horror on his face. I wondered if he kept his promise. If complaint number 7, 2A4491C, had actually changed anything at all. Pulling the card out, I sat down at my new desk. For weeks, the story had been a monster living in my head, a loop of trauma and terror. But looking at that card, it felt like something else. A tool, a weapon I hadn't finished using. I opened my laptop. A blank document glowed in the quiet room. The cursor blinked, a patient, steady heartbeat. I started to type. I wrote about a landlord whose greed found a name, a slick, user-friendly brand that promised adventure to tourists and profit to property owners. A brand that never has to see the cracks in the foundation. I wrote about the seductive, dangerous lie that a home is just a space, an asset to be leveraged, and not the bedrock of a person's life. I wrote about my call to the Department of Buildings and the systemic indifference that acts as an accomplice to predators like Mark, who count on the system being too slow, too broken to stop them. I wrote about an 84-year-old woman watching her memories get covered in plaster dust, and how she was dismissed as collateral damage in someone else's business plan for a high-turnover Airbnb. The words came out not with anger, but with a cold, hard clarity. It wasn't a revenge story anymore. It was a warning. It was a blueprint. It was for the next person who hears a saw in the middle of the night, for the next person who gets told their emergency isn't an emergency. I had lost my home, but I had found my voice again, and I was going to make sure it was heard. I hit save, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in my apartment felt like peace. Hitting save felt more final than the judge's gavel. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place, not on a door, but on a chapter of my life. That document on my screen wasn't just words, it was the entire ugly, terrifying experience, caged and cataloged. It was mine now. I owned it. Mark didn't. The indifferent city clerk didn't. The trauma didn't. I did. My old apartment had been my sanctuary. When that was taken, I thought I'd lost everything. But a sanctuary isn't just four walls. It's the place you can be yourself, where you have control. By writing it all down, by turning my pain into a story I could tell, I was building a new one. This one wasn't made of plaster and brick. It was made of truth, and no one could ever evict me from it. The fight isn't over, of course. For every Mark who gets caught, there are 100 more out there, scrolling through listings, seeing dollar signs where families see homes. They're still counting on the system to be slow, on tenants to be scared into silence. They're still using the promise of a perfect 5-star Airbnb experience as a weapon to tear communities apart. But now, my story is a weapon too. It's a warning and it's a guide. It proves that you can fight back. It proves that one voice, amplified, can be louder than a circular saw. I'm safe now, not just in this new apartment with its quiet radiator, but safe in the knowledge that I survived the collapse and refused to be buried in the rubble. I found a way to build something new from the wreckage. And if my story can serve as a foundation for someone else, if it can help even one person feel less alone when they hear that noise from downstairs, then none of it was for nothing. This is the story of how I took my life back. If you want to help me share it and make sure these stories are heard, please like and subscribe.